Lie down and listen to the story tonight. The year is 44 BC, and the city of Rome trembles on the edge of destiny. The air hangs heavy with anticipation, for tomorrow will mark the Ides of March, a day etched into history as the moment when Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul and master of the Roman Republic, will fall beneath the knives of his closest allies. But tonight, he sleeps, and in his dreams unfolds a nightmare so vivid, so terrifying, that it will echo through time. The great dictator, whose armies stretched the boundaries of Rome across continents, lies restless in his chamber on the Palatine Hill. The marble walls of his villa are cold, but his mind burns with visions he cannot escape. Shadows flicker from the torches, forming shapes on the ceiling that seem to move of their own accord. His wife, Calpurnia, lies awake beside him, sensing the storm within her husband's mind. Outside, Rome slumbers uneasily. Senators whisper in dark corners, daggers hidden beneath their togas. Streets that once celebrated Caesar's triumphs now carry rumors of tyranny. The people hail him as a god, but the Senate fears him as a king. Power has made him untouchable, or so it seems. In his nightmare, Caesar finds himself walking through the forum, but the marble pillars are stained red. Statues of the gods bleed from their eyes, and the sky darkens with a crimson haze. He hears the cries of the people, once shouts of victory, now wails of betrayal. He turns to see the theater of Pompey, looming larger than life, its doors wide open as though inviting him into a trap. From within, he hears whispers, "Beware the Ides of March." He tries to speak, but his voice is drowned by the sound of knives unsheathing. Figures approach him, familiar faces of men he trusts, Cassius, Casca, Brutus. Their smiles are warm, but in their hands gleam blades dripping with shadow. Caesar reaches out, but the moment his fingers brush theirs, the metal plunges into his chest. He staggers back, falling onto the very steps of the Senate, as the conspirators' laughter echoes like thunder. Blood pours from his body, yet he remains alive, forced to watch as each stab tears away another piece of his soul. The nightmare twists further. Rome itself seems to fall apart. The streets crumble into rivers of blood, temples collapse, and the people scatter like frightened birds. Caesar sees his face carved into stone, worshipped as a god, only to be shattered by the hands of those who once praised him. Then a single voice cuts through the chaos. "Et Brute?" He hears himself whisper, not with anger, but with heartbreak. He looks into Brutus's eyes, filled not with hatred but with sorrow, as though this betrayal is the deepest wound of all. The vision grows colder. Caesar sees his body lying lifeless on the Senate floor, covered by a simple cloak, abandoned by all. Above him, a raven circles, its wings blotting out the last ray of sunlight. The city burns around him, and he awakens in a cold sweat. Calpurnia stirs, her eyes filled with worry. For weeks she has dreamt of omens, statues bleeding, comets blazing across the sky, voices in the night warning of danger. She clutches his arm, begging him to take heed. "My lord, do not go to the Senate tomorrow. I have seen you murdered in my dreams. I have seen Rome weep." Caesar, still trembling from his nightmare, tries to dismiss it as superstition. He is a soldier, a conqueror, a man who fears no mortal blade. Yet deep inside, a seed of doubt takes root. The dream felt more real than any battle he has fought. He rises from the bed and walks to the window. Rome stretches out before him, lit by the faint glow of torches and the stars above. It is the city he has given his life to, the city he has ruled with unmatched authority. And yet, in this moment, it feels hostile, as though every shadow hides a traitor. The silence of the night is broken by distant howls of dogs and the creaking of wooden carts. Every sound seems a warning. Caesar whispers to himself, "The Ides of March, just another day." But even he does not believe his own words. He turns back to Calpurnia, who pleads with him again. "Stay home. The gods are speaking to us through dreams. Do not tempt fate." Caesar smiles faintly, placing his hand upon hers. The gods have always spoken in riddles. If I am to die, it will be because destiny wills it, not because of a dream. Yet in his heart, the nightmare lingers. He lies back down, closing his eyes, but sleep will not return. He sees again the faces of Brutus and Cassius, the glint of daggers, the blood that seemed endless. He sees his own statue toppled, his name cursed, his glory turned to ashes. Rome, eternal and proud, does not mourn him in his vision. It devours him. The night stretches on, each hour slower than the last. Outside, the city awaits dawn, and with it, the Ides. Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, feels powerless against the weight of fate. His final nightmare is not just a dream, it is a prophecy. Tomorrow it will come true. Dawn broke over Rome, casting a pale light across the tiled roofs and marble temples. The Ides of March had arrived, and with it a tension that clung to the air like mist. Julius Caesar rose from his bed, his body heavy from restless sleep. The nightmare still lingered in his mind. Visions of blood, betrayal, and the cold eyes of Brutus. Calpurnia stirred beside him, her face pale with dread. She clutched at his arm, her voice trembling. "You must not go to the Senate today. I saw you murdered in my dream, your body pierced with wounds. The gods do not send such warnings in vain." Caesar paused, her words striking deeper than he wished to admit. He had dismissed omens before, brushed off superstitions as the weakness of lesser men. But this dream was different. It had shaken him in a way no battle ever had. Still, pride was a shield he refused to lower. "Dreams are but shadows, Calpurnia," he replied gently. "If I allowed them to rule me, I would never have crossed the Rubicon, never conquered Gaul, never ruled Rome. Shall I now cower in my home because of a dream?" Calpurnia's eyes filled with tears. She pressed on, her voice urgent. "It is not only my dream. The priests found omens in the sacrifices, animals without hearts, strange signs in the heavens. Last night, the walls of our house seemed to drip blood in my vision. The city itself whispers of death. Please, my lord, stay home. For one day, defy not the gods." Caesar sighed, torn between the rational soldier and the superstitious Roman. He had always considered himself favored by fortune, a man chosen by destiny. Yet something about this day unsettled him. He paced to the window, looking out at Rome below. The streets were already alive with murmurs, merchants setting out their wares, senators making their way toward the forum. But there was a heaviness in the air, as though the city itself anticipated tragedy. At that moment, a servant entered, bowing low. "My lord, the Senate awaits. Messengers have already gathered." Caesar turned back to Calpurnia, who stood with desperation etched into her face. Her love for him was plain, her fear undeniable. For the first time, he considered yielding. "Very well," he said slowly. "Perhaps I will send word that I am unwell and shall not attend today." Relief flooded Calpurnia's eyes. She clasped his hands, whispering a prayer to the gods. But fate had already set its course. Before the message could be sent, a familiar figure entered, the trusted Decimus Brutus, a man Caesar considered loyal. He bowed respectfully, his tone confident yet persuasive. "Caesar, the Senate has assembled to honor you. They plan to present you with new titles, new powers. If you do not appear, they will think you scorn them. The people may turn restless, believing you fear them. Rome's order depends on your presence." Caesar frowned, his resolve wavering. Calpurnia stepped forward, her voice firm. "Decimus, you do not understand. He must not go. I have seen his death in a dream. The omens cry out against this day. If you care for him, you will tell him to stay." Decimus smiled, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. "My lady, dreams are but shadows. The Senate is filled with men who already question Caesar's strength. If he hides in his home today, they will whisper that he is weak, that he fears the Senate. Is that the image we should present to Rome?" Caesar studied Decimus carefully. His words rang true to the ears of a man who had built his life on conquest and power. To show fear now, in front of senators already wary of his authority, would undermine everything he had fought for. Yet the dream gnawed at him, Calpurnia's pleas weighed heavy, and the omens of the priests echoed in his mind. He was caught between love and pride, between warning and destiny. Outside, the city grew louder. Chariots rattled over cobblestones. Merchants called their prices. But beneath it all lay a hum of unease. Rumors spread that the gods had turned against Caesar, that the Ides would bring change. Even common folk muttered of curses and doom. Decimus pressed harder. "Great Caesar, will you let a dream chain you? The Senate waits to hail you as their leader. The people expect to see your face. Shall they think you fear phantoms?" Caesar straightened his shoulders, the soldier within him stirring. To be seen as weak, to yield to superstition, it was unthinkable. "You are right, Decimus. I cannot allow whispers of cowardice to spread. I will go." Calpurnia cried out, clutching his arm. "Please, my husband, do not. You walk into death." Caesar placed a hand on her cheek, his voice soft but unyielding. "If death comes today, it comes by destiny's hand. No man, no dream, no omen can change it. Better to meet fate as a Roman than hide like a frightened child." Tears streamed down her face as he donned his robes, the purple and white toga that marked his authority. Each fold of the cloth seemed to weigh heavier than the last, as though destiny itself draped across his shoulders. The household prepared for departure, servants bustling nervously, guards adjusting their weapons. Decimus stood ready, his face calm though his heart hid betrayal. Outside, the streets awaited Caesar's passage. As he stepped from his home, the crowd murmured, some in awe, others in dread. Mothers pulled children close, priests bowed with wary eyes, and in the distance, a raven perched on the roof, its caw sharp and chilling. Caesar ignored it, holding his head high. He was Julius Caesar, conqueror, dictator, master of Rome. Yet in the depth of his heart, the echo of the nightmare remained. Each step toward the Senate felt heavier, each sound sharper, as though the world itself whispered of his approaching end. The morning of the Ides had begun, and with it the final march of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar stepped out of his home into the cool morning air of Rome, his toga wrapped firmly around him, his guards flanking him on either side. The city was awake now, bustling with movement, but something about its rhythm was wrong. The clatter of chariots seemed too loud, the cries of vendors too sharp, and the whispers of the people too hushed whenever his figure passed. The Ides of March carried with it an air of unease that no man could ignore. He had dismissed Calpurnia's pleas, silenced the voice of his own doubts, and chosen to trust the words of Decimus. Yet as his sandals struck the cobblestones, Caesar could not shake the sense that every step drew him closer to a destiny he could neither avoid nor control. Crowds gathered along the street to glimpse the great dictator. Some cheered, shouting his name as if he were a god walking among men. Others lowered their heads, whispering prayers beneath their breath, as though in fear of what was to come. An old woman pushed through the throng, her voice cracking as she cried out, "Beware, Caesar! Beware the Senate this day!" Guards shoved her back, dismissing her as a madwoman, but Caesar's heart skipped at her words. He remembered the soothsayer from weeks before, the one who had warned him with the same chilling phrase, "Beware the Ides of March." He tried to shake it from his mind, but the words clung to him like chains. As his litter carried him forward, Rome itself seemed to whisper. Dogs howled in the distance, horses reared without reason, and flocks of birds wheeled chaotically in the sky. Priests hurried past, muttering of strange sacrifices gone wrong. Every omen pointed to disaster, yet Caesar's pride would not let him falter. To turn back now would be to show fear. And Caesar, the man who had crossed the Rubicon and defied the Senate, would not allow fear to govern him. Along the way, his loyal companions engaged him in conversation. Mark Antony, ever the soldier, rode near and spoke boldly. "The Senate awaits, Caesar. Today may be the day they finally crown you king in truth. Rome needs order, and you alone can bring it." Caesar smiled faintly but did not answer. The idea of kingship was a dangerous one in Rome, a word dripping with hatred since the days of Tarquin. Yet the possibility had always hovered over him, unspoken but real. Perhaps today would have been that day, if not for the whispers of betrayal already swirling in the air. As the party neared the theater of Pompey, a man broke through the crowd, clutching a folded scroll. His name was Artemidorus, a teacher of rhetoric, but in his hands he carried more than words. He had learned of the conspiracy, had overheard the whispers of Cassius and Brutus, and now he bore a warning written in his own hand. "Caesar," Artemidorus cried, pushing past the guards. "Read this, my lord, I beg you. It concerns your life and the danger that waits in the Senate." Startled, Caesar paused. The guards moved to strike the man down, but Caesar raised his hand. He took the scroll, glancing at the earnest face of the teacher. "What is this, Artemidorus?" "Read it, Caesar," Artemidorus urged. "Read it now, before it is too late." Caesar nodded but tucked the scroll into his toga, choosing to wait until later. He had been handed petitions and letters countless times before. Why should this one be different? Yet Artemidorus's desperate eyes lingered in his mind, filled with urgency that could not be dismissed. Decimus leaned close, whispering, "Pay him no mind, Caesar. The Senate awaits, and delay will only offend them. Read it after the session." Caesar gave a curt nod, though unease tightened his chest. The scroll pressed against his skin beneath the folds of his toga, as though it burned with secrets he dared not look upon. The procession continued, weaving through the streets of Rome. Along the way, more omens appeared. A statue of victory, once gleaming in the sun, now stood defiled, its arm broken and its laurel wreath missing. Children pointed at it, whispering that the gods had withdrawn their blessing. A sudden gust of wind swept through the street, extinguishing torches and scattering dust. The crowd murmured, some making the sign of protection against evil. Caesar lifted his chin, pretending indifference, but every detail carved itself into his memory. His guards muttered among themselves, and even Antony grew uneasy. Yet still they pressed on. When they reached the steps of the theater of Pompey, Caesar paused. He gazed up at the great structure, built by the man who had once been his greatest rival and later his victim. It was here, within these walls, that the Senate had chosen to gather. A bitter irony struck him. Pompey's shadow lingered, and in its embrace Caesar would meet his fate. Artemidorus appeared once more, breaking through the crowd in desperation. He clutched Caesar's arm, his voice frantic. "Read my letter, Caesar. Read it now, for within it lies the truth of treachery." Caesar frowned, beginning to draw the scroll from his toga. But Decimus intervened swiftly, placing a hand upon his shoulder. "Later, my lord. Business awaits inside. Do not keep the Senate waiting." Torn between curiosity and pride, Caesar hesitated. The crowd pressed closer, senators already waiting at the entrance, their faces masks of loyalty hiding daggers in their hearts. At last, Caesar folded the scroll back into his toga and strode forward. Artemidorus cried out once more, his voice cracking with despair. "You will not live to read it, Caesar. The gods themselves cannot save you if you ignore this warning." The dictator did not answer. He walked with the dignity of a conqueror, his every step a march into destiny. Behind him, Artemidorus sank to his knees, his warning lost amid the clamor of Rome. The gods had spoken through dreams, omens, and the voice of a loyal man. Yet Caesar chose not to listen. The theater of Pompey loomed larger now, its shadows stretching like the arms of death. Inside awaited the Senate, and with it the knives of betrayal. Caesar lifted his chin, his pride unbroken, even as the world whispered of his doom. The scroll lay unread against his chest, a final chance spurned, a lifeline ignored. Fate had sealed its grip, and the Ides of March drew him inexorably toward its bloody climax. The theater of Pompey loomed before Julius Caesar like a monument of irony. Built by Pompey the Great, once his ally and later his bitter rival, it now stood as the chosen site of the Senate. Within its halls, where Pompey's ghost seemed to linger, Caesar would face the judgment of men who had once sworn loyalty to him. He climbed the steps slowly, each footfall echoing as though fate itself marked the rhythm. Senators gathered at the entrance bowed low, their gestures of respect masking hearts filled with treachery. Some smiled too warmly, others avoided his gaze entirely. Caesar, ever perceptive, noticed their unease but dismissed it as politics as usual. He had lived his life surrounded by plots and conspiracies. Why should today be different? Yet deep inside, the remnants of his nightmare stirred. The torches along the walls flickered, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The statues of Roman gods that adorned the portico seemed to watch silently, their stone eyes offering no protection. Inside, the Senate chamber awaited, its curved benches filled with men whose names history would remember not for their service but for their betrayal. Cassius leaned against a column, his jaw tight, his hand hidden within his toga where the hilt of a dagger pressed cold against his palm. He glanced at Brutus, who sat apart, his face pale, torn between loyalty and conviction. Cassius whispered to him earlier, "If he crowns himself king, Rome is lost. You must strike with us, Brutus, for the Republic depends on it." Brutus's heart was heavy, for Caesar had been more than a leader, he had been a friend, almost a father. Yet Brutus had convinced himself that the act was not murder but sacrifice, a necessary wound to preserve liberty. Nearby, Casca muttered under his breath, rehearsing the moment he would strike first. His dagger weighed heavily in his hand, though he imagined it sinking into Caesar's flesh. The conspirators exchanged subtle glances, nods, and movements, a silent language of betrayal. They had chosen their moment carefully. When petitions were presented to Caesar, they would close in, surround him, and plunge their blades as one. Outside the chamber, Mark Antony lingered, unaware of the depth of treachery around him. He trusted Brutus and Cassius as fellow Romans, never suspecting the storm about to break. He busied himself speaking with guards and senators, ensuring the day's business would proceed smoothly. Had he known, he would never have allowed Caesar to walk into the chamber unprotected. Caesar entered the chamber with the dignity of a conqueror. The chamber of the Senate was cloaked in silence, the kind that arrives before a storm. Julius Caesar stood at the center, his toga draped across his broad shoulders, his eyes scanning the faces that surrounded him. They were senators, men sworn to uphold the Republic, but in this moment their eyes betrayed something darker. They were conspirators, each carrying a dagger hidden within folds of cloth, each waiting for the signal. The statues that adorned the hall seemed to lean forward as if to bear witness. Above them all loomed the statue of Pompey, frozen in marble but alive in memory, the old rival whose shadow had never fully faded. It was under Pompey's cold gaze that Caesar would face his reckoning. Casca moved first. He stepped closer, his petition raised like a shield of falsehood. His eyes flickered with hesitation, but the pressure of the circle drove him onward. In a sudden motion, he dropped the petition and lunged. His dagger flashed, aimed at Caesar's throat. The blade scraped across flesh, not deep but enough to draw blood. Caesar recoiled, shocked, his voice bursting out in disbelief. "Casca, what treachery is this?" For a heartbeat, the chamber froze. Then chaos erupted. Cassius surged forward, his dagger slashing. Others joined, Servilius, Cinna, Decimus. All striking, their blades tearing through toga and flesh. The sound was a horrific symphony. The gasp of Caesar, the grunts of effort, the scrape of steel on bone, and the rustle of togas in frenzied motion. Caesar struggled, his strength not yet gone. He seized Casca's arm, driving it aside, his soldier's training returning in a flash. With his other hand, he struck Cassius across the face, sending the senator stumbling backward. "Villains!" Caesar roared, his voice shaking the chamber. "Do you dare raise steel against Caesar?" But the daggers kept coming. One sliced into his side, another across his shoulder. Blood began to stain his pristine toga, dark and spreading. The senators, once dignified men, now looked like beasts, their faces twisted with desperation and fury. Casca called out in panic, "Help, brother!" And the conspirators rallied with renewed savagery. Caesar staggered backward, his body screaming in pain, but his spirit unbroken. He tried to push toward the entrance, toward the safety of his guards, but the circle closed tighter. Blades flashed, tearing into him from every side. He fought like the general he had always been, even without a sword in hand. He shoved one attacker back, his bloodied fist striking like a hammer. Another lunged, and Caesar twisted, the blade grazing instead of piercing. For a moment he seemed unstoppable, the old fire of his campaigns burning once more. But he was one man against dozens. Each wound weakened him, each stab drained his strength. His toga, once a symbol of power, now clung heavy with blood. He stumbled near the foot of Pompey's statue, his vision blurring. Then he saw him, Brutus. At first, Caesar's eyes lit with hope. Here was the man he loved like a son, the one whose loyalty he had never questioned. Surely Brutus would stop this madness, shield him from the traitors. But Brutus's face was pale, his jaw set, his dagger drawn. He hesitated, his hand trembling, torn between friendship and conviction. For a heartbeat, the chamber seemed to hold still. Caesar, bleeding, broken, locked eyes with him. In those eyes he saw not hatred but sorrow, the sorrow of betrayal. "You too, Brutus?" Caesar whispered, his voice cracked with anguish. The words were not a shout, not an accusation, but a plea, a final thread of trust snapping. Brutus stepped forward, his blade driving into Caesar's side. The dictator's strength crumbled. He gasped, the betrayal cutting deeper than any wound. The others followed, emboldened by Brutus's strike, plunging their daggers again and again. 23 blows rained down upon him, each one tearing away another piece of the man who had once commanded legions and conquered nations. Caesar no longer resisted. His arms dropped, his body sagged. He pulled his toga around him, covering his face and legs in the old Roman tradition, seeking dignity in death even as it was stolen from him. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling at its feet, staining the marble red. The conspirators stepped back, their chests heaving, their daggers dripping crimson. The chamber was filled with the stench of blood, the echoes of violence still ringing in the air. For a moment silence returned. Then one by one, the senators wiped their blades on their togas, as though cleansing themselves of guilt. Brutus stood apart, his face ghostly, his hand shaking. He had struck Caesar, but in that act he felt not triumph but emptiness. The man he had revered lay dead at his feet, and the republic he sought to save seemed smaller than the shadow of the deed he had committed. Outside the chamber, the people of Rome waited, unaware that their world had just shifted. The dictator who had bent nations to his will, who had defied gods and men alike, now lay lifeless on the cold stone floor. His nightmare had come true, every vision fulfilled in blood. And in the stillness of the Senate, under the gaze of Pompey's statue, the greatest man of Rome met his end, not by foreign enemies, but by the hands of his friends. The Senate chamber was thick with the smell of iron and death. Julius Caesar lay sprawled at the base of Pompey's statue, his once white toga drenched in red. The conqueror of Gaul, the master of Rome, the man who had defied kings and gods, now lay lifeless on the cold stone floor. His body seemed smaller now, diminished by betrayal, his glory drowned in silence. The conspirators stood over him, their daggers dripping crimson. For a long moment, none moved. The echoes of their violence still reverberated in the marble walls. The room was filled not with triumph but with dread. Cassius was the first to speak, his voice shaking despite his attempt at strength. "It is done. The tyrant is no more." He looked around at the other senators, as if seeking validation. But many avoided his eyes, their faces pale with horror at what had just transpired. They had killed Caesar, yes, but in doing so, they had torn apart the very heart of Rome. Brutus stood apart, his dagger still in his hand, though he no longer had the strength to hold it steady. Blood stained his robe, not his own but Caesar's, and it seemed to burn against his skin. He had convinced himself that this act was necessary, that it was for the Republic, for liberty, for Rome. Yet as he gazed upon Caesar's lifeless body, doubt gnawed at his soul. The man he had loved, trusted, followed, slain by his hand. His heart felt hollow. Casca, his face pale and slick with sweat, wiped his dagger against his toga, muttering under his breath. He fought like a lion. I thought he would never fall. The others murmured in agreement, some trembling, others trying to mask their fear with bravado. Decimus, who had lured Caesar from his home, looked down at the corpse with something close to regret. "We must not linger," he said sharply. "The people will soon hear. We must show them that this was not murder, but justice." Justice! Mark Antony's voice thundered suddenly as he appeared at the doorway. He had been delayed outside, speaking with soldiers and attendants, but now he stood frozen, staring at the bloody scene before him. His eyes widened, his fists clenched. He stepped forward, his face twisted with fury. "You call this justice? You butchered the greatest man Rome has ever known." The conspirators moved quickly, forming a barrier between Antony and Caesar's body. Cassius raised his hand. "Antony, listen to us. This was not slaughter, it was salvation. Caesar sought to crown himself king. He would have enslaved Rome under his will. We have struck not against a man, but against tyranny." Antony's gaze burned with rage, but he forced himself to remain still. He knew he was outnumbered, unarmed. His loyalty to Caesar roared within him, but survival demanded patience. "You speak of liberty while you drip with his blood," he spat. "You think the people will see it as noble? They loved him. They worshipped him. You have unleashed chaos upon Rome." Brutus stepped forward, his voice calm but heavy with sorrow. "Antony, I know your grief. Do not mistake me. I loved Caesar as you did. But I loved Rome more. Would you have him crowned a king, Antony? Would you see the Republic destroyed? This act was not born of hatred but of necessity. Caesar was too great, too ambitious. If he had lived, freedom would have perished." Antony studied Brutus closely. Unlike Cassius, whose words reeked of self-interest, Brutus's sincerity was undeniable. Antony's mind raced. He could not strike them here, not yet. But already he was plotting. He bowed his head slightly, his voice softer. "If you believe this was for Rome, then grant me one request. Let me take his body. Let me speak at his funeral." The conspirators exchanged uneasy glances. Cassius shook his head. "Dangerous. If he stirs the people, all our work will be undone." Brutus raised a hand. "No. Let Antony speak. If we forbid it, the people will suspect we fear the truth. I trust him. He will not betray us." Antony lowered his gaze, masking the fire in his eyes. "I swear, Brutus, I seek only to honor Caesar as a friend. Nothing more." Brutus nodded. "So be it. But you shall speak after we have spoken, so the people may first hear why we acted." Cassius muttered his disapproval, but he did not challenge Brutus. Already cracks were forming within the brotherhood of conspirators. They had struck together, but their motives were not the same. Cassius hungered for power, Brutus for principle, Casca for survival. Their unity would not last. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, the city stirred. Rumors spread like wildfire. Caesar was dead. Some shouted in disbelief, others in panic. Mothers clutched their children. Merchants shuttered their stalls. Soldiers muttered uneasily. Rome trembled, as if the very foundations of the Republic quaked beneath the weight of betrayal. Within the Senate, the conspirators began to plan their next move. "We must march to the Forum," Cassius declared. "We must show the people Caesar's body, proclaim our deed as noble, and win their hearts. If we delay, Antony will seize their loyalty." Brutus hesitated. He looked once more at Caesar, his heart heavy. "Yes," he said quietly, "but we must not speak as butchers. We must speak as saviors. Rome must believe that Caesar died not for ambition, but for liberty." They lifted their daggers high, shouting, "For the Republic!" Their voices echoed through the chamber, but it sounded hollow against the stillness of Caesar's corpse. Antony watched in silence, his face expressionless. Inside, though, he burned. He would give them their moment, let them bask in their hollow triumph. And then, at the funeral, he would turn the people of Rome against them. For now, the greatest man of Rome lay dead, his blood pooling beneath Pompey's statue, the very symbol of rivalry and revenge. Caesar's nightmare had become reality. He had dreamt of betrayal, of Brutus's hand striking, and so it had come to pass. But in death, his shadow would linger longer than any dagger. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, though the skies were clear. Rome itself seemed to mourn, the gods restless. The conspirators marched out, their togas stained, their blades raised. They thought themselves liberators. Yet they carried with them not freedom but the seed of civil war. The conspirators emerged from the Senate chamber with their daggers still wet, their togas stained with crimson. Before them, the lifeless body of Julius Caesar was carried by servants, wrapped hastily in blood-soaked cloth. The sight silenced the forum. The people, who had gathered outside the theater of Pompey, gasped as one. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a cold wind. "Caesar is dead." Mothers clutched their children tighter. Old men shook their heads in disbelief. For many, it felt as if the very sun had been blotted out, for Caesar had become more than a man. He was Rome itself. Cassius raised his dagger high, the blood glistening in the sunlight. "Romans," he shouted, "behold, Caesar is dead not by foreign hand, but by ours, your fellow citizens. We have slain not a man, but a tyrant who sought to crown himself king." His voice carried across the forum, but it rang harsh, defiant. Some nodded in approval, but many more stood stunned, their loyalty to Caesar too deep to be so easily severed. Then Brutus stepped forward, his voice calmer, steadier, filled with the weight of sincerity. "People of Rome," he called out, "hear me. I loved Caesar as you did. No man loved him more, but I loved Rome more. Would you rather see him live as a king, enslaving us all, or die as a man, leaving us free? If there is any among you who loved him, know that Brutus loved him too. If there is any among you who mourns him, know that Brutus mourns as well. But if there is any among you who values liberty, know that I struck for you." A murmur swept the crowd. Unlike Cassius's sharp words, Brutus's appeal reached their hearts. His honesty disarmed suspicion. The people had long known Brutus as a man of virtue, a senator who placed the republic above ambition. To hear him confess his love for Caesar even as he justified his death gave weight to his words. Some in the crowd even began to cheer faintly, "For Brutus! For liberty!" The conspirators seized upon this moment, lifting their hands as if to swear before the gods. "We are no tyrants," Brutus declared. "We seek no crown, no throne. We have spilled this blood so that Rome may live free. Look upon our daggers. They are stained not for glory, but for you. Romans, trust us, for we have risked our very lives to preserve the republic." The people wavered. Some shouted in agreement, convinced that the conspirators had saved Rome. Others wept openly, staring at Caesar's body with grief too sharp to be dulled by speeches. The city trembled between mourning and doubt, torn between love of Caesar and fear of tyranny. Standing apart, Mark Antony watched in silence. His heart raged with fury, but his face was calm. He saw how Brutus swayed the people with words of virtue. He understood that to strike now would be folly. The conspirators were armed, the crowd uncertain. But Antony's mind was already weaving a plan, a speech that would undo them all. He stepped forward, his voice measured. "Romans, I too loved Caesar. I served him faithfully in war and peace. My heart is heavy with grief. But if Brutus says he was ambitious, and if Brutus says he sought to be king, then Brutus is an honorable man. And I, Antony, will not deny it." The crowd turned to him, listening intently. Cassius eyed him warily, but Brutus placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "He is with us," Brutus whispered. "Trust him." Antony bowed slightly, masking his contempt. "I do not come to accuse but to mourn. Let us not quarrel in grief. Let Caesar be buried with honor, and let Rome move forward. Only then shall we see if the gods bless this act." The people murmured approval, comforted by Antony's restraint. Brutus stepped closer to him. "You shall have that honor, Antony. You may speak at his funeral. But remember, speak only what is fitting, nothing that would stir rebellion. For the Republic must endure." Antony lowered his gaze, his voice soft. "I promise, Brutus. I seek only to honor my friend." But in his heart, Antony swore a different oath. He would speak, yes, but his words would not soothe. They would ignite. They would turn the people's grief into fury, their sorrow into fire. The conspirators dispersed, some to wash the blood from their hands, others to gather their supporters in the forum. Brutus lingered, gazing once more at Caesar's shrouded body. His heart ached with conflict. He believed he had saved Rome, yet a shadow of doubt already crept in. He whispered softly, so that only he could hear, "Forgive me, Caesar. If this act was wrong, may the gods judge me." Antony knelt beside the body once the others were gone. He pulled back the cloth, revealing Caesar's wounds, each a gaping mouth of betrayal. His eyes burned with unshed tears. "O mighty Caesar," he whispered, "do you lie so low? You who stood above kings, now pierced by the hands of cowards? But fear not, they shall pay. By these wounds, I swear it." He kissed Caesar's hand, then rose, his face transformed. The mask of obedience was gone, replaced by the fire of vengeance. In that moment, Antony's course was set. He would not rest until the blood of Caesar's killers stained the streets of Rome. The crowd began to disperse, still murmuring, still divided. Some believed Brutus, clinging to the idea that Caesar had been too ambitious. Others whispered Antony's name, sensing in him a grief that matched their own. The city teetered on the brink, balanced between peace and chaos, waiting for a spark. That spark would come at Caesar's funeral. And Antony, standing over his fallen friend, already knew the words that would ignite the fire. The day of Caesar's funeral dawned heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves mourned. The forum filled with citizens from every corner of Rome, pressing shoulder to shoulder, their voices hushed with grief and anticipation. At the center lay the bier of Julius Caesar, draped in purple and gold, his lifeless body concealed but his presence undeniable. Soldiers stood guard, their armor polished, their faces grim. Around the square, the conspirators assembled, their togas clean now, their daggers hidden but their deeds known. They carried themselves with a confidence born of necessity, though in their hearts unease lingered. They knew the people loved Caesar, but they hoped words could sway loyalty into acceptance. Brutus rose to speak first. He stepped onto the rostrum, the raised platform overlooking the sea of faces. The crowd hushed. Brutus lifted his hands, his expression solemn. His voice rang clear, steady, filled with conviction. "Romans, countrymen, and friends, hear me for my cause, and be silent that you may hear." He paused, letting the weight of silence gather. "I loved Caesar as you did. No man here loved him more. If his ambition had not threatened our freedom, I would not have raised a hand against him. I wept for him as a friend, I honored him as a soldier, I admired him as a leader. But I struck him as a tyrant." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Brutus pressed on. "Would you rather Caesar lived, and all of us die as slaves? Or that Caesar died, and Rome lives free? As Caesar loved me, I weep for him. As he was fortunate, I rejoice. As he was brave, I honor him. But as he was ambitious, I slew him." The crowd stirred, nodding, whispering agreement. Brutus's words carried weight. He was known for his virtue, his honesty. If Brutus said Caesar was ambitious, many were inclined to believe it. Brutus spread his arms wide. "If there be any in this assembly, any dear friend of Caesar, to him I say, Brutus's love to Caesar was no less than his. If then that friend demands why Brutus rose against Caesar, this is my answer. Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. A cheer rose from parts of the crowd. For Brutus! For the Republic! Brutus nodded gravely, then concluded. With this I depart. If my word has offended, I have the same dagger ready for myself should my country demand it. He stepped down, his eyes heavy with sorrow. The crowd erupted into applause, shouts of loyalty echoing through the forum. The conspirators smiled faintly, relief washing over them. Perhaps the people would accept the deed. Perhaps the Republic would stand. But then Mark Antony stepped forward. The air shifted instantly. Antony stood tall, his expression one of grief, his eyes red as though from tears. He waited until the cheers subsided, then raised his hand. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," he began, his voice soft, trembling with sorrow. The crowd quieted. "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar." He paused, glancing toward the conspirators. "The noble Brutus has told you Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man. So are they all honorable men? I come to speak at Caesar's funeral." The crowd shifted uneasily. Antony's words honored the conspirators, yet his tone carried a subtle sting. He continued, weaving sorrow into his speech. "He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms filled the treasury. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man." Murmurs stirred among the people. Doubt flickered. Antony's grief was raw, his words persuasive. He reached into his toga and held up Caesar's will, sealed with wax. "You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you, then, to mourn for him? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me." He turned away, covering his face as if overcome with grief. The crowd erupted with cries of sympathy. "Read us the will!" they shouted. Antony shook his head, his voice choked. "It is not meet you know how much he loved you. You are not wood, you are not stones, but men. If you should hear the will, it would inflame you, it would make you mad. It is good you know not that you are his heirs. For if you should, what would come of it?" The people clamored louder. "The will! Read the will!" Antony hesitated, then relented. "You will compel me, then? You will rise against the men who struck him." "The will!" they roared. Antony opened the scroll and read, "To every Roman citizen, Caesar has left 75 drachmas. To every man here he gives his wealth. He leaves you his private walks, his orchards, his gardens, for your use forever. This was Caesar's love for you." Gasps spread through the forum. The people looked at one another in shock. Caesar, even in death, had given them more than they had expected in life. Antony seized the moment. He stepped down to the bier, pulling back the cloth to reveal Caesar's wounds. The crowd recoiled, horrified. Antony pointed to each stab, his voice rising with passion. "You all do know this mantle. Look, in this place ran Cassius's dagger through. See what rent the envious Casca made. Through this, the well-beloved Brutus stabbed, and as he plucked his cursed steel away, mark how the blood of Caesar followed it, as rushing out of doors, to be resolved if Brutus so unkindly knocked. And Brutus is an honorable man." The crowd howled in anguish. Antony raised his arms. "You are men, not stones. Look here, here is Caesar, stabbed 23 times. Was this ambition? Was this justice? You loved him once, not without cause. What cause holds you now to mourn him not? Oh, you weep, and it makes me mad. Here lies the most noble man that ever lived in the tide of times. And now you rise to mutiny." The forum exploded. The people screamed in fury. shaking their fists at the conspirators. Revenge! Burn! Kill the traitors! Antony stood tall, his face a mask of fire. Here was Caesar. When comes such another? The crowd surged, breaking into chaos. Some ran to seize the conspirators, others to set fire to their houses. The will had sealed their fury. The wounds had broken their hearts. Antony had turned mourning into rage, grief into revolution. The conspirators fled, their hopes crumbling. Rome itself was ablaze, and in the heart of the storm, Antony whispered to Caesar's spirit, "Now, let's slip the dogs of war." The forum dissolved into chaos. What had begun as a funeral became a riot, a wave of fury crashing against the walls of the city. The words of Antony still echoed in the ears of the people. His gestures toward Caesar's wounds seared into their minds. The crowd erupted in anger, their grief twisted into vengeance. "Revenge for Caesar!" they roared. "Down with the traitors!" Torches were snatched from the hands of soldiers and merchants alike. The people surged through the streets, their faces contorted with rage. They tore down banners, smashed windows, and stormed the homes of senators known to be part of the conspiracy. The house of Casca was the first to burn, flames licking high into the night as neighbors hurled stones and curses. Servants fled screaming, their masters nowhere to be found. The mob showed no mercy, dragging statues into the streets, covering them in pitch, and setting them ablaze. The smoke rose into the sky, a black signal of Rome's fury. In the forum, Antony stood watching, his heart pounding. He had unleashed the storm he intended, but even he was stunned by its ferocity. He had given the people a spark, and now Rome was consumed in fire. Beside him lay Caesar's body, still upon the bier, now surrounded by wailing citizens who kissed his hands, touched his blood-stained cloak, and swore oaths of vengeance. Antony raised his arms, calling out above the roar, "Citizens of Rome, let Caesar be avenged, but do not destroy the Republic. Strike not the innocent, but the guilty. Seek the traitors who stabbed him, not your neighbors." But his voice was swallowed by the tempest. The people no longer listened. They were a beast loosed from chains, and no man could master them. Antony turned away, his mind racing. He needed allies. Caesar's death had left a vacuum, and only swift action could fill it before chaos swallowed Rome entirely. He thought of Octavian, Caesar's young heir, barely 18 but already named in his will. The boy had ambition, and more importantly, the loyalty of Caesar's veterans. Together they could seize control. While Antony plotted, Brutus and Cassius fled the forum with the other conspirators. They had believed their cause, just that their words would hold the people. But Antony's speech had shattered their illusion. Now the city that once revered them as liberators hunted them like criminals. "We must escape Rome," Cassius urged, his voice frantic. "The people are mad. They will tear us apart." Brutus, his face pale, nodded slowly. His heart was heavy, his conscience in turmoil. He had killed Caesar believing it was for the Republic, but now he saw only flames and fury. "We will leave, gather our armies in the provinces," he said grimly. "Rome is lost to us, but not forever. If Antony seizes power, we will return with legions and strike him down." The conspirators scattered, slipping through alleys, bribing guards, fleeing toward the countryside. Behind them, their homes burned, their names cursed by the mob. Rome itself seemed to turn against them, spitting them out like poison. In the streets, the violence grew. A poet named Cinna, mistaken for the conspirator of the same name, was torn to pieces by the mob simply for sharing his name. Shops were looted, temples desecrated, and the cries of vengeance rose like a hymn to blood. Antony moved swiftly to restore order where he could. He dispatched soldiers loyal to Caesar to protect key buildings, but the city was too vast, the fury too widespread. He knew the only solution was to channel the chaos, to direct it outward. He gathered his allies, men who had served with Caesar, and spoke to them with urgency. "The people are with us," he declared. "They hate the traitors, they love Caesar, and they will follow us. But we cannot rule with mobs and fire. We must form strength, we must raise legions. Caesar's heir, Octavian, will soon come to Rome. Together we shall avenge Caesar and secure the Republic, or what remains of it." That night, Antony visited Octavian in secret. The young man, pale and serious, listened intently as Antony described the riot, the speech, and the city's descent into chaos. Octavian clenched his fists. "They have slain my father in all but blood. If the people love me as they loved him, I will not rest until his killers are destroyed." Antony studied him carefully. He saw in the boy a reflection of Caesar's will, but also ambition sharper than any blade. For now, their goals aligned, and Antony knew they must stand together. "Then we will form an alliance," Antony said. "You, the heir, I, his general. Together, we will hunt Brutus and Cassius to the ends of the earth." In the smoldering city, rumors spread faster than fire. Some said Caesar's ghost had been seen walking near the forum, his wounds glowing like embers, urging the people to vengeance. Others swore that thunder rolled over Rome without clouds, a sign the gods themselves demanded justice. The city had become a crucible, melting down into rage and fear. And in the heart of it all, Caesar's body lay in state, his bloodied toga a relic, his will a weapon, his memory more powerful in death than in life. By morning, Rome was unrecognizable. Ash coated the streets. The scent of smoke clung to every wall. The conspirators were gone, fled into the provinces. The people, exhausted but still seething, looked to Antony for direction. And Antony, now joined with Octavian, prepared for the next act of the tragedy. Civil war. The conspirators had fled Rome, but Rome itself pursued them. Brutus and Cassius rode hard through the Italian countryside, their minds heavy with guilt and fear. They had struck for liberty, or so they told themselves. Yet everywhere they went they heard the same cries. "Caesar is avenged!" Villages burned offerings at roadside shrines to the slain dictator. The republic they claimed to save now cursed their names. Cassius seethed with anger. "We killed a tyrant, Brutus, but the people loved him more than they loved freedom. We must raise armies before Antony and the boy Octavian destroy us." Brutus, pale and weary, nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. He could not silence the image of Caesar's face, the look of betrayal in his eyes. It haunted his dreams, as though the nightmare Caesar once suffered had passed into him. While Brutus and Cassius rallied legions in the east, Rome fell into the hands of new rulers. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus forged an uneasy alliance, the Second Triumvirate. They carved the republic between them like a carcass, each taking provinces, each raising armies, each thirsting for revenge. Their first act was brutal: proscription. Lists of enemies were nailed to the forum walls. Those named were hunted, their wealth seized, their families slaughtered. Blood ran in the streets once more, but now it was for Caesar's memory. Antony's voice thundered as he declared, "For every wound Caesar bore, let 100 traitors perish." Octavian, though young, proved ruthless. He approved the death of Cicero, once Rome's greatest orator, whose tongue was nailed to the rostra as a warning. The Republic gasped under the weight of tyranny disguised as justice, but the triumvirs cared only for power and vengeance. In the east, Brutus and Cassius gathered legions, proclaiming themselves defenders of liberty. They sent forth coins stamped with daggers and the words the Ides of March, as if to justify their crime. Soldiers followed them, but whispers of doubt grew louder with each passing day. Many asked if liberty had been worth the death of Caesar, whose ghost seemed to rise larger with each telling. 2 years after the Ides, the reckoning came. At Philippi in Macedonia, the armies of the conspirators faced the legions of Antony and Octavian. The plains stretched wide beneath a dark sky, banners snapping in the wind, thousands of soldiers bracing for war. Before the battle, Brutus sat alone in his tent, his sword across his knees. Sleep would not come. When at last he closed his eyes, a shadow appeared. Caesar's ghost, pale and bloodied, loomed before him. "Brutus," the specter whispered, "you will see me at Philippi." Brutus awoke trembling, sweat soaking his robe. He told no one, but the terror gnawed at him. He marched to battle knowing that fate itself walked beside him. The clash at Philippi was brutal. Cassius fought fiercely, his sword cutting down enemies with desperate rage. But confusion spread through his ranks, and in the chaos he believed his legions lost. Overcome with despair, Cassius ordered a slave to drive a sword into him. As he fell, his final words were bitter. "Caesar, you are avenged." Brutus fought on, his soldiers loyal to the end. Twice he rallied them, striking hard against Octavian's lines. But Antony's veterans, hardened from Gaul and civil war, pressed relentlessly. Surrounded, outnumbered, Brutus saw the collapse. He fled to a quiet grove with a handful of loyal men. There, under the shade of trees, he made his decision. "My hour has come," he said softly. "Caesar's spirit haunts me still. Better to die by my own hand than be paraded as a prisoner." He fell upon his sword, held steady by a companion. His blood stained the earth, and with it died the last hope of the conspirators. News of Brutus's death spread swiftly. Antony, hearing it, stood silent for a long moment. Though Brutus had slain Caesar, Antony still respected him as a man of principle. He declared, "This was the noblest Roman of them all." All the rest acted out of envy of great Caesar, but he alone believed it was for the Republic. May he be honored, though fallen. Yet Octavian thought only of power. With Brutus and Cassius gone, nothing stood in his way. Antony and Lepidus still shared rule, but Octavian's ambition would soon consume them as well. In time, he would defeat Antony, cast aside Lepidus, and crown himself Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The republic Brutus had sought to save would vanish, replaced by an empire more absolute than Caesar had ever dreamed. And so the nightmare was fulfilled. Caesar, slain for ambition, became immortal in memory. His killers, who thought to preserve liberty, instead ensured its death. Rome wept for him, Rome avenged him, Rome crowned his heir. The Ides of March, meant to free the republic, became the birth of the empire. Across the plains of Philippi, ravens circled, feasting on the dead. Soldiers whispered that Caesar's ghost walked among them, smiling grimly at his revenge. His prophecy, his nightmare, had come true. Betrayal, blood, and the endless echo of daggers. In death, Caesar ruled more than he ever had in life.